For 24 years, she ruled with an iron grip, silencing attorneys and shattering lives, until one man flipped the script and had her arrested in her own courtroom. Inside the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, the air felt heavy, not from the summer heat pressing against its stone walls, but from something deeper, an unspoken truth that had settled there for decades. Everyone who stepped through those towering oak doors knew exactly how things worked in Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom. She was the kind of judge who rarely lifted her gaze over the rim of her reading glasses, yet her sharp eyes cut through attorneys as if they were mere annoyances. Her voice never rose, never wavered, but the weight of her authority crushed anyone who dared to challenge her. For 24 years she had sat on the bench, long enough to leave a legacy. Not one carved into plaques or celebrated in legal journals, but one whispered about in courthouse hallways, muttered in hushed tones at bar association gatherings. Attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew precisely what they were up against the moment their case landed in her courtroom. The rulings always leaned one way. The objections she sustained or overruled followed a pattern no one could prove, but everyone understood. And today that pattern was about to be tested. Marcus Grant stepped into the courtroom, the sharp click of his polished Oxfords against the marble floor cutting through the tension. He had stood in this room before, but today was different. He wasn't just another defense attorney facing Judge Whitmore. He wasn't just another name on the docket. Today he had something she never saw coming. Marcus, 48, had built his career on taking the cases no one else wanted. His reputation extended far beyond Alabama, and his ability to dismantle a prosecution's argument made him a marked man in courtrooms like this. But that had never stopped him before. What did stop him, just for a fleeting second, was the look in her eyes as he approached the defense table. She already despised him, not because of the case, not because of anything he had said, but because of who he was. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down. This wasn't just about his client, Jamal Rivers, a man falsely accused of armed robbery. This wasn't just about proving innocence. It was about something far greater, and he wasn't leaving this courtroom without making that clear. "Mr. Grant," Judge Whitmore said, barely glancing at him as she flipped through the case file, "you're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. The trial hadn't even started. Marcus tightened his grip on his briefcase, but kept his expression unreadable. "I'll do my best, Your Honor." She smirked. "Good, because I have a full docket and I don't need theatrics." She turned to the prosecution. At the opposite table sat a young assistant district attorney, Ethan Calloway, fresh out of law school, eager to impress the wrong people. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Calloway said, barely masking his smirk as he shot a glance toward Marcus. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Jamal Rivers sat beside Marcus, hands clasped, shoulders hunched forward. It was the posture of a man who had been in the system too long, who had seen too much, heard too much, lost too much. Marcus leaned in slightly. "We're ready too," he said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply. "Let's get this over with." The trial began. But it wasn't a trial, it was a performance, and Judge Whitmore had the starring role. Every objection Marcus raised was dismissed without a second thought. Every time Calloway stumbled through a legal argument, she guided him like a professor coaching a favorite student. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, but no one was bold enough to say a word, except Marcus. He studied her, the way her lips curled in displeasure whenever he spoke, the way she barely concealed her disdain. This wasn't just bias, it was something worse, something he had spent years preparing for. But the courtroom didn't know that yet. Marcus had seen hostile courtrooms before, but this was different. Judge Whitmore wasn't even trying to hide it. Every time he spoke, she cut him off. Every time he raised a valid argument, she waved it away like an annoying fly. Courtrooms had a rhythm. Lawyers spoke, judges ruled, juries listened. But in this courtroom, Judge Whitmore had already decided the verdict before the trial even began. Marcus caught the unease in the jury, the way they shifted in their seats. Even some of the white jurors who might have walked in with their own biases couldn't ignore what was happening. But Judge Whitmore didn't care. She doubled down, her voice sharper with every word. "Mr. Grant, you're testing my patience." Her tone was ice cold. Marcus met her gaze. "And you're testing the law, Your Honor." "I'll hold you in contempt, Mr. Grant. This is not a lecture hall. If you want a grandstand, do it somewhere else." Marcus kept his expression steady, but inside his blood burned, not because she was insulting him, he could handle that, but because she was making it personal, and that was a mistake. Still, he needed her to keep talking, to keep exposing herself. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured, "the prosecution just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in discovery. That's a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Whitmore leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with exaggerated boredom. "Denied." Marcus didn't react, not out of shock, but out of strategy. He let the silence hang for just a second before speaking again. "To be clear, Your Honor, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Whitmore's lips thinned. "I said denied, Mr. Grant." He could feel the room shifting, the reporters scribbled faster, the whispers in the gallery grew louder. She saw it too, her eyes darkened, and for the first time she looked directly at him. "You are dangerously close to being held in contempt, Mr. Grant." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "For what, Your Honor? Asking the court to follow the law?" Whitmore slammed her gavel so hard the sound cracked against the high ceilings. "That's enough," she snapped. "One more word and I'll have you removed." The room went silent. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, but he wasn't nervous. This was exactly what he needed. His client, Jamal Rivers, clenched his fists under the table. "Man, don't let her do this to you," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't even glance over. "I have nothing further, Your Honor," he said smoothly, taking his seat. Whitmore scoffed, acting as if she had won. But what she didn't realize was that the game had just begun, and she had played right into his hands. Marcus sat still, his expression unreadable. He knew when to push and when to pull back just enough to let someone destroy themselves. And Whitmore was doing just that. The jury exchanged looks. Some glanced toward the gallery where reporters were scribbling furiously. Everyone felt it now, the shift, the discomfort, the exposure of a judge who had grown too comfortable in her own power. But Whitmore wasn't backing down. She straightened in her chair, her voice cold. "Mr. Calloway, continue with your questioning." Ethan Calloway cleared his throat, clearly rattled. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He saw what was happening, too. "Yes, Your Honor." He turned to the witness stand, where a nervous-looking store clerk sat. "Mr. Thomas, can you confirm that the defendant, Jamal Rivers, was the man you saw at the scene of the robbery?" The old man hesitated. Marcus leaned forward slightly, watching. He had seen this kind of hesitation before, the kind that meant someone wasn't as sure as they had been coached to be. Whitmore wasn't interested in hesitation. "Answer the question," she pressed. The witness flinched. I think so," he said finally. Marcus stood up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. That is not a definitive statement." Whitmore didn't even hesitate. Overruled. Marcus exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly, just enough for the jury to notice. He let Calloway fumble through a few more questions before rising for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand, his voice steady. "Mr. Thomas, you said you think you saw my client that night. How sure are you?" The man licked his lips. "I mean, I thought I saw him, but you're not certain?" Whitmore cut in before the witness could answer. "Move on, Mr. Grant." Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. This was too blatant, too obvious. "I'd like the witness to answer, Your Honor." I said, "Move on." Marcus didn't blink. "For the record, Your Honor, you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own statement." Whitmore's face twitched. "I'm warning you, Mr. Grant." Marcus smiled, just slightly. "I understand, Your Honor." He turned back to the witness. "No further questions." Walking back to the defense table, slow and deliberate, Marcus could feel the tension in the room tightening. The air had shifted again, twisting, closing in. Whitmore knew she was losing control of the room, and Marcus knew it was time, because he wasn't just here to win this case, he was here to end her. His fingers brushed against the stack of documents in his briefcase, the ones that would change everything. And just as he did, the heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open. The sound alone was enough to shift every pair of eyes away from the witness stand. 2 federal agents in dark suits strode in, their movements crisp. The room went still, a silence so deep it swallowed the air itself. Marcus didn't react. He simply smoothed out his tie. Marcus folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Judge Whitmore's eyes flickered, first with confusion, then irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" One of the agents, a tall man with a clipped demeanor, flashed a badge. "Judge Eleanor Whitmore, we need to speak with you immediately." Her jaw tightened. "I am in the middle of a trial." The agent didn't budge. "It's urgent." Marcus watched as the confusion on her face morphed into something else, something dangerously close to fear, just a flicker of it, quickly buried under a mask of judicial arrogance. She squared her shoulders. "This is highly inappropriate. Whatever this is, it will have to wait until I've concluded these proceedings." The second agent stepped forward, this time addressing the entire courtroom. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Even the jury, sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide their curiosity. Ethan Calloway, the prosecutor, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Should we take a recess, Your Honor?" Whitmore's fingers curled into the bench. "No," she snapped. "We are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow—" The first agent interrupted. "We have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp rippled through the room. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Eleanor Whitmore lost control of her courtroom. Marcus let the moment breathe, let the weight of it settle in every corner of the room. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stood. He turned, taking in the jury, the gallery, the reporters scribbling furiously. Then, finally, he faced her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice even, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns." Whitmore's face drained of color. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his jacket. "Eleanor Whitmore, you are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law." The room erupted. The gallery exploded with voices, some shocked, some delighted, some stunned into silence. The jury sat frozen, their eyes darting between Marcus and the woman on the bench. Whitmore looked at the agents, then at the paper, then at Marcus. And for the first time she truly saw him, not just as another attorney arguing a case before her, but as the man who had been waiting for this moment. "Mr. Grant." Her voice wasn't sharp anymore, it was unsteady. Marcus picked up his briefcase and stepped forward, locking eyes with her. "I told you," he said, his tone calm, unwavering. "I follow the law. Even when the law fails people like me." The lead agent moved closer to the bench. "Judge, we need you to stand." She didn't move. Then, finally, she did. And when the agent snapped the cuffs around her wrists, the courtroom wasn't just watching. They were witnessing a reckoning. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the chamber, sharp and final. For 24 years, Judge Eleanor Whitmore had ruled this courtroom with an iron grip. Attorneys feared her, defendants knew they didn't stand a chance. The system had protected her for decades, turning a blind eye to her rulings, her bias, the thinly veiled contempt she held for attorneys like Marcus Grant. But now she stood in the very spot where she had condemned countless men before, wrists bound, eyes frantic, power slipping. The air was electric. A once-in-a-lifetime moment no one had expected to see. The jury, the gallery, even Ethan Calloway, the young prosecutor who had been so eager to please her, all stared in stunned silence. Marcus let the moment stretch. He had spent years building toward this, gathering every piece of evidence, tracking every bribe, every unethical ruling, every case she had manipulated. He had been patient, playing the long game, knowing that one day the weight of her corruption would become too heavy to ignore. And today was that day. One of the federal agents pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and began reading the charges aloud. Eleanor Whitmore, you are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Whitmore finally found her voice. This is outrageous, she hissed. The lead agent didn't even blink. You can take that up with your lawyer. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail. The way Whitmore's hands shook, the way her once imposing presence seemed so small now. She turned to Marcus, her voice laced with something between rage and disbelief. You, she spat. This is your doing. Marcus lifted his chin slightly. This is justice, he corrected. For the first time in his career, the balance had shifted. Whitmore tried to compose herself, but it was useless. The power she had wielded for so long was gone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. For years, she had sat in judgment, handing out hollow lectures about accountability and respect for the law. And now, she stood before the very system she had abused. The agents moved her toward the doors, but not before one final humiliation. A court officer, someone who had worked under her for years, who had once bowed to her authority without question, held the door open for her, like she was just another defendant. Whitmore hesitated, then stepped through. The doors slammed shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. The courtroom was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting his hands rest on the defense table. His client, Jamal Rivers, turned to him, his expression a mix of shock and awe. Man, Jamal muttered, shaking his head. I thought people like her never paid for what they did. Marcus glanced at the empty judge's bench. They do, he said eventually. But the real lesson, that was still to come. The courtroom had never felt this alive. The gallery, still in shock, erupted into hushed conversations. Some whispered in disbelief, others in barely contained satisfaction. The jury looked around at one another, silently confirming that they had all just witnessed the same thing. Marcus remained still. He had fought battles in court before, but this was different. He had played the long game, knowing that Whitmore's corruption was too deep, too bold, too reckless to remain hidden forever. And now, after years of patience, of gathering evidence, of waiting for her to make one final mistake, justice had finally arrived. And yet Jamal Rivers was still in handcuffs. Judge Whitmore was gone, but the trial she had stacked against him was still unfinished. Marcus turned, leveling his gaze at Ethan Calloway, the young prosecutor who had once looked so confident, so sure of himself under Whitmore's protection. Not anymore. Now Calloway was pale, his hands gripping the edges of his notes like a drowning man clinging to a life raft. He had just lost his safety net. Marcus cleared his throat. Your Honor, he said, directing his words toward the replacement judge, an older black man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, who had just been rushed in to take over the proceedings. Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The judge folded his hands together. "On what grounds, Mr. Grant?" Marcus turned to the jury. "On the grounds that this entire trial was poisoned from the start. Judge Whitmore's arrest proves what we've known all along. She was never impartial, and neither were her rulings. This case was manipulated. Evidence was ignored, and my client was never given a fair trial." He let the words sink in, then turned back to the judge. "And now that the woman who orchestrated this injustice is in handcuffs, the only thing left to do is undo the damage she caused." The judge leaned back slightly, studying Marcus with the kind of measured patience that only experience could provide. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I agree." A heavy pause fell over the room. Then, "The charges against Jamal Rivers are dismissed. Bailiff, remove his restraints." For a second, no one moved. Then, Jamal let out a breath, one he had been holding for years. The courtroom officer unlocked the handcuffs, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal's hands were his own again. The moment was so thick with emotion that even Calloway didn't object. He just sat there, staring at the desk, looking like a man who had lost something much bigger than a trial. Jamal rubbed his wrists, then turned to Marcus, his voice low. "I don't even know what to say." Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, because today the justice system actually worked. Not because it was built that way, but because someone fought to make it happen." Jamal stood, looking around the courtroom that had nearly swallowed him whole. Then, without another word, he walked out. Marcus followed, the weight of what had just happened pressing against his chest. Because this wasn't just about Jamal. This was about every case Whitmore had ever ruled on, every innocent man she had sent away, every bribe she had taken, every biased judgment she had passed. This was just the beginning. Marcus had won today, but tomorrow he had work to do, because there were more Whitmores out there, and he wasn't done yet. If you believe in real justice, if you believe in holding power accountable, don't just watch. Make your voice heard. Like, comment, and subscribe.